The soft, late-afternoon sun filtered through the towering windows of the grand stateroom, casting long, golden rectangles across the polished marble floor. The air, usually thick with the formality of royal protocol, was filled with the lighter sounds of a family gathering. It was a private afternoon tea, a chance for the senior members of the royal family to relax away from the scrutiny of public engagements. At the center of the room, a low table was laden with delicate china cups, tiny sandwiches, and an array of colorful cakes. The conversation was a gentle hum, a mixture of stories from recent tours and gentle jokes. Princess Charlotte, a vibrant 7-year-old with an air of quiet confidence that belied her age, was seated on a small, velvet-upholstered stool. She was meticulously arranging a set of miniature toy horses on the rug before her, creating a complex parade that only she could see. Her brother, Prince George, was nearby, listening to his father, the Prince of Wales, describe a falconry display he had witnessed. Charlotte was content in her own world, her brow furrowed in concentration as she positioned a proud-looking stallion at the front of the line. Across the room, near the grand fireplace, Camilla, the queen consort, was engaged in a conversation with her sister, Annabel Elliot. Their voices were low and punctuated with occasional laughter. Beside them, looking somewhat restless, was Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's elder son. Tom, a food writer and critic in his 40s, was a man more accustomed to the vibrant chaos of a professional kitchen than the quiet stillness of a royal drawing room. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the room, from the intricate ceiling moldings to the family photographs on the grand piano, before finally settling on the children. His gaze lingered on Charlotte. There was a flicker of something in his expression, perhaps a memory of his own children at that age, or a simple, curious observation. After a moment, he straightened his jacket and began to walk towards her. His footsteps were muffled by the thick antique rug. "Hello there," he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet space. "That's a very impressive collection you have." Charlotte looked up, her blue eyes wide and assessing. She offered a small, polite smile. That's the kind she had been taught to give to visiting dignitaries. "Hello," she said softly, before returning her gaze to her horses. She was carefully placing a small, prancing foal behind the stallion. Tom took another step closer, now standing directly over her. "What are their names?" he asked, gesturing to the horses. "Do they have names?" Charlotte hesitated. "This one is Victory," she said, pointing to the stallion, "and this is Sparkle." "Sparkle?" Tom chuckled, a short, sharp sound. "That's a bit of a silly name for a horse, isn't it? Horses should have strong names like Thunder or Blaze. Victory is a good name, but Sparkle? What can Sparkle do?" Charlotte's small hand instinctively covered the little foal, as if to protect it from his words. A tiny furrow appeared between her brows. She didn't like the way he was talking about Sparkle. Sparkle was her favorite. "Sparkle is the bravest," she said, her voice quieter but firm. "She looks after the baby horses." Tom laughed again, a little louder this time. "Bravest? A horse with a name like Sparkle can't be brave. Maybe you should rename her. What about Daisy? That's a bit better, still a bit soft, but better than Sparkle." This was not a teasing comment. It was a correction, a dismissal of her creation. Charlotte's lower lip trembled slightly, but she pressed them together, a trait she had inherited from her father. She looked away from him, back at her horses, trying to ignore him, a tactic she had seen her mother use with persistent photographers. But Tom wasn't finished. He bent down, reaching a hand towards the little foal. "Here. Let me see this so-called brave horse." It was the violation of her space that did it. As his fingers touched the tiny plastic mane of her beloved Sparkle, something inside Charlotte snapped, It wasn't a tantrum. It was a flash of pure protective instinct. Her small hand shot out and knocked Tom's hand away from the toy. "Don't touch!" she exclaimed, her voice sharp with sudden anger. The sound cut through the genteel murmur of the room like a bell. Tom, startled, reacted without thinking. He stumbled back a half step, but in doing so his foot caught the edge of the rug, causing him to lurch forward. Off balance and surprised by the child's fierce reaction, his momentum carried him towards her. It wasn't a deliberate lunge, but to anyone watching it appeared as a large, grown man suddenly stumbling aggressively towards a seated child. For a single terrifying second, the scene was frozen. The Queen Consort's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. The Prince of Wales's head snapped around, his face a mask of confusion and immediate paternal alarm. But one man was already moving. Standing like a granite statue by the main door, dressed in the unmistakable dark tailcoat and polished shoes of the royal family's personal protection, was a royal protection officer. He was a man named Sergeant Davies, a veteran of the force with over 20 years of experience. His face was an unreadable mask, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, a human lie detector trained to spot the tiniest anomaly in a room. He had seen Tom approach the children, a permissible action. He had seen the exchange, cataloging the man's body language, the slight lean into the child's space, the dismissive tone. It was a microaggression, nothing more. But then came the stumble. Sergeant Davies didn't see a man stumbling. He saw a potential threat vector. He saw a large male figure suddenly moving with unsteady, uncontrolled momentum directly towards a protected principal, a child of the blood royal. Years of split-second decision-making, of training that had drilled the what-if scenarios into his very bones, took over. In the time it took for the Prince of Wales to fully turn his head, Sergeant Davies had crossed half the room. He didn't run. He moved with a terrifying, fluid economy of motion. He was between Tom and Charlotte before the man had even regained his balance. His body was a solid, immovable wall. He didn't touch Tom, didn't lay a hand on him. He simply inserted himself into the space. In his presence, an undeniable physical barrier. His face, still calm, now held a silent, unyielding question, his eyes boring into Tom's. "Sir?" The officer's voice was low, calm, and utterly authoritative. It was a statement, not a greeting. It was a boundary. Tom, finally catching his balance, looked up into the officer's unwavering gaze. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. He saw the proximity to the little girl, saw the officer's defensive posture, and saw the horrified looks now fixed on him from around the room. His face drained of color, flushing a deep mottled red an instant later. I just tripped," he stammered, his voice cracking. He took a large, clumsy step backward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. The room was utterly silent. And the only sound was the soft clink of Camilla's teacup as she set it, trembling, back onto its saucer. The moment hung in the air, thick with shock and the dawning comprehension of what had almost happened, or what had so clearly been perceived. The royal guard had stepped in, not with violence, but with an impenetrable wall of silent duty. In the heavy silence that followed Sergeant Davies's intervention, the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to tick with an unnatural loudness. The color was high on Tom Parker Bowles's cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and a dawning, uncomfortable realization of how his actions had been perceived. He stood frozen, his hands still slightly raised, looking like a man who had accidentally wandered onto a live theater stage during the climax of a play. Sergeant Davies did not move. He remained a sentinel, his eyes still holding Tom's for a long, meaningful second before he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He then turned his attention to Princess Charlotte. His gaze softened, the hard, assessing edge melting away to reveal a flicker of something gentler. He gave her a small, reassuring wink, so quick that anyone not looking directly at him would have missed it. Charlotte, who had shrunk back against her stool, her eyes wide, stared up at him. She didn't smile, but the rigid line of her small shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. The officer then took a single, silent step back, repositioning himself a little closer to the children, but melting once more into the background, a ghost in a tailcoat. The spell was broken by the Prince of Wales. He moved swiftly, his face a careful mask of calm, but his eyes were sharp as he approached. Charlotte? You're all right, my darling?" "Charlotte? You're all right, my darling?" His voice was a low, private murmur meant only for her. Charlotte nodded, a little jerkily. "Yes, Papa. He was going to take Sparkle." Prince William's gaze flickered briefly to the small toy horse on the rug, then towards Tom, a cold, fleeting glance that spoke volumes. He squeezed his daughter's shoulder. "Sparkle is quite safe. You were very brave." He then glanced at George, who had watched the entire scene with wide, serious eyes. "Everything is fine," he said to both of them, his voice steady and reassuring. Across the room, the scene was very different. Camilla, the queen consort, was on her feet. Her face was pale. On his arm, a gesture that was both a gesture that was both a comfort and a restraint. "Tom," she said, her voice low and strained, "perhaps we should take some air." Tom looked at his mother, his expression a chaotic mix of shame and frustration. "I tripped, Mother. I simply tripped. It was an accident." "Of course," Camilla said smoothly, her public face sliding back into place, though her eyes remained troubled. "A simple accident. Nevertheless, some air would do us all good." As she guided him towards the French windows that led out to a small private terrace, Tom glanced back into the room. His gaze landed on the Royal Protection Officer, who was now standing quietly by a pillar, in seemingly examining a painting on the wall. Their eyes met for a split second. The officer's face was a complete blank, showing neither accusation nor judgment. He simply looked away, his attention returning to his perpetual scan of the room. It was that very lack of reaction, that professional absence of emotion, that was perhaps the most damning judgment of all. On the terrace, away from the stifling heat of the room, Camilla turned to her son. "Tell me exactly what happened." Tom ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "I was just talking to the little girl about her toys. I made a joke, she got upset, and when I went to see the toy, she hit my hand. It startled me, and I stumbled. That's all. It was nothing. And now that security guard looks at me as if I were a criminal." Camilla listened, her expression pensive. And she knew her son, knew his sometimes clumsy social manner, his lack of the finely tuned radar required for navigating the delicate ecosystems of royal life. She also knew the unforgiving nature of the world they inhabited. Perception was reality. "It wasn't nothing, Tom," she said softly, her gaze on the manicured gardens below. "Not here. Not with them." She turned to him, her eyes holding a plea. "You have to understand, these children are not just children. They are symbols. Their protection is absolute. Those men, the protection officers, they are not just for show. They are trained to see threats where others see nothing. To them, an unsteady movement towards a child is a potential kidnapping, a potential assault. It is their job to prevent it before it can even be defined." Tom stared at her, the weight of her words settling on him. He had always viewed the security as a formality, a necessary but slightly absurd part of the royal pageantry. He had never truly considered the constant underlying current of vigilance that governed their lives. Meanwhile, back in the state room, the gathering was discreetly breaking up. Annabel Elliot made her excuses to the Princess of Wales, who had been observing the aftermath with quiet composure. The cake remained uneaten on the table. The miniature horses were being carefully gathered by a nanny who had silently appeared. Later that evening, in the private apartments of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the incident was discussed in hushed, urgent tones. The news, of course, would not leave the room. It was a family matter, and it would be dealt with as such. But a line had been crossed, and a line of trust and safety. The primary duty of any parent is to protect their child, and in that room, for a terrifying second, they had been reminded that this duty was shared with, and in that moment, entirely carried out by, a silent, dedicated professional whose name they might not even know. The unshakable calm of Sergeant Davies was a stark contrast to the tremor that had run through the heart of the family. For Sergeant Davies, the evening ended not with a commendation, but with a quiet, detailed entry in a logbook. He noted the time, the location, the individuals involved, and a clinical description of the event. Subject TPB made unexpected, rapid movement towards Principal PC. Interposed to create barrier. No contact made. Incident resolved. For him, it was a moment of successful threat neutralization, on another tick in a long career of unseen interventions. He had no idea that his simple, decisive action had cemented itself in the memory of a 7-year-old girl and had fundamentally altered the perception of safety within one of the most famous families in the world. The next few days passed in a strange, muted silence within the royal household. There were no official apologies, no awkward family dinners. The incident in the stateroom became an unspoken thing, a ghost that hovered in the corridors, acknowledged only in the briefest of glances. Tom Parker Bowles did not return to Clarence House. He retreated to his home in the countryside, nursing a wound to his pride that was far deeper than any physical injury. He replayed the moment 100 times, each time cringing at his own clumsiness, his own social ineptitude. And he had not meant any harm, but intention mattered little against the cold, hard wall of perception. For the Prince and Princess of Wales, the days were filled with quiet, deliberate actions. They spent more time with their children, the shadow of the event making their time together feel more precious. They didn't discuss it with George and Charlotte directly, but they watched them more closely, their hugs a fraction tighter, their good nights a little longer. Charlotte, however, seemed to have processed the event in her own way. She was quieter than usual, but not withdrawn. One afternoon, she was in the schoolroom, drawing at the small table by the window. Her mother, Catherine, came to sit with her, a cup of tea in her hand. "What are you drawing, my love?" Catherine asked, peering at the page. Charlotte held up the picture. It was a simple crayon drawing. There was a small figure in a sparkly pink dress standing behind a tiny horse, and beside her, standing tall and imposing, was a much larger figure dressed all in black, with a serious face and a kind smile. The larger figure had a speech bubble coming from his mouth. In Charlotte's wobbly 7-year-old handwriting, it simply said, "I've got you." Catherine felt a lump form in her throat. She gently touched the drawn figure of the guard. "Is this who I think it is?" Charlotte nodded, her face serious. "He stopped the man who was going to hurt Sparkle. He was very fast, like a superhero but without a cape." Catherine smiled, pulling her daughter into a gentle hug. "He is a very special kind of superhero," she whispered into her hair. She knew then that the incident had left a mark. But it was not one of fear. It was one of profound, unshakable security. Her daughter had learned a powerful lesson about protection, not from lectures, but from a lived experience. The story, however, was far from over. It had planted a seed of quiet unease in the relationship between the Prince of Wales and his stepmother, Camilla. They were cordial, as duty demanded, but a new layer of formality had settled between them. A phone call was made, a private conversation between William and his father, the king. The subject was never explicitly named, but the implication was clear. The children's safety, both physical and emotional, was paramount, and the presence of anyone who might, however unintentionally, compromise that needed to be carefully managed. Weeks turned into a month. The story became family lore, the tale whispered in the strictest confidence. For the other members of the Royal Protection Squad, Sergeant Davies's actions became a textbook example of perfect protocol. He was quietly respected, his already legendary status within the close-knit circle of royal security solidified. He never spoke of it. When a colleague clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good work with the Parker Bowles thing," he simply gave a curt nod and changed the subject. To him, it was just another day at the office. Then came the Trooping the Color. It was a day of immense public spectacle, with crowds lining the mall, waving Union Jacks. The royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, a sea of colorful outfits and smiling faces. There, in the carefully orchestrated tableau, stood the Prince and Princess of Wales with their children. Invisible in the shadows of the balcony's interior, stood the ever-present protection officers. Sergeant Davies was one of them. His gaze, as always, was on the crowd, scanning, assessing, his face an unreadable mask. As the fly-past roared overhead, a deafening crescendo of sound, little Charlotte startled slightly. It was a tiny flinch, barely noticeable. But Sergeant Davies saw it. He saw her small hand grip the balcony railing a little tighter. Without a word, without drawing any attention, he shifted his weight. He moved a single silent step forward, out of the deep shadow and into the periphery of the balcony. And he positioned himself just at the edge of Charlotte's vision. He didn't look at her, his eyes still fixed on the distant rooftops. But his presence was now a solid, reassuring anchor in her peripheral view. Charlotte, feeling the vibration of the jets in her chest, glanced to the side. She saw the tall, familiar figure in the dark suit. There was no wink this time, no smile. Just the same solid, unmovable presence she remembered from the stateroom. The man who was very fast, the superhero without a cape. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Her small shoulders straightened. She turned back to the crowd and waved, her hand steady and confident. On that balcony, in front of millions of people, a silent, powerful bond was affirmed. It was a bond built not on words, but on a single, decisive action in a quiet room. For Princess Charlotte, the roar of the crowd and the might of the RAF were impressive, but the quiet, steady presence of the man behind her was the only real source of safety she needed. And for Sergeant Davies, it was another day of duty done, another small, invisible victory in a lifetime of service, a guardian watching over his charge, ready, as always, to step in.